Join us today on Beyond the Lair, where we have a conversation with CEO and County Chair of Shell Canada, Susannah Pierce. We talked to Susannah today about authenticity, relationship building, and making a difference with profit for purpose in her goal to bring awareness to the prevention of human trafficking. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Beyond the Lair. We are thrilled to have the great Susannah Pierce today. My name is Gina Jackson Montgomery. I'm a proud member of the Seashell Nation. I'm one of the co-hosts of Beyond the Lair. I'd like to introduce my other co-host.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dean Montgomery, and great to see you, Susannah.
It's good to see both of you, as always. Thanks for having me here.
We are very thrilled and honored to have Susannah Pierce with her. Not only is she a very good friend, but she is also one of the episode 1 judges and finale judges for the Bears Lair season 2, which is coming out June 4th. So we're really excited to see Susannah participate in that. But I'll give you a little bit of background before Susannah introduces herself. Susannah Pierce is the president and county chair for Shell Canada Limited. She has held successfully senior roles in the technology and energy sectors in the United States, Canada, and Europe for over her 22-year-old career. How can you have been in the industry that long? She looks like she's literally 25.
So kind.
It's true.
So kind.
In each of these roles, she has brought an innovative and entrepreneurial mindset to improve the business outcomes, as well as deeper relationships with internal and external stakeholders and Indigenous communities. Susannah is a high standard and is passionately committed to her company's success, team's performances, and their individual development and goals. And she's very well respected in the corporate world and the community where she lives. Susannah also has so many different personal initiatives and also represents some amazing initiatives with Shell Canada, which really is profit with purpose. And we're going to talk about some of her initiatives with entrepreneurism, with Indigenous support, and one of her passions, not just now, but how it came about with human trafficking. Mm-hmm. So what does an oil and gas company have to do with all of this? We're going to find out. So Susannah, welcome to our programming.
Hey, Gina and Dean. It's really awesome to be here with both of you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And thanks for that intro. I mean, the bio is really the bio. You know, at the end of the day, I'm just a regular person who's had opportunities to do some pretty cool things. And, you know, and I'm very lucky to be here, very lucky to be alive, very lucky to have a chance to have an impact, and very lucky to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you for being here. I know that your reputation precedes you, because every single person, there's not many people in the industry that every single person has something really positive to say about you. Whether it's, I mean, you're beautiful inside and out for sure, but what is it like growing up? Tell us a little bit about how you grew up, how you got into the oil and gas sector, because I know you speak Spanish, because my husband also speaks Spanish, and the rest of this podcast will be in Spanish. Just kidding. But let's hear a little bit about you, because people know the Susannah that they see in the LinkedIn's and when you do your keynotes and for all your initiatives. But let's find out a little bit about you and where you grew up and how you became you.
Well, thanks, Gina. And, you know, it's funny, I was having this conversation last night over dinner. And, I said, you know, it's funny because I still feel like that 14, 15-year-old girl whose dad says she was a bit squirrely, too much of a daydreamer, and she probably wouldn't amount to much. And I was thinking about that just last night and thinking, how do you perceive me any different? Because I still go back to that person who still hasn't figured it all out, who still thinks about what she's going to do next, how she fits in. And, you know, for me as a kid growing up, my father was in the industry, in the energy industry. He was in the pipeline companies. And my mother, who was a professional singer, gave it all up to marry my dad and moved to Regina, Saskatchewan from Toronto. That was a big culture shift. And then she had myself and my sister, and she had 2 young boys from another marriage. And we grew up, born in Regina, moved to Calgary. And so I grew up with a family that was engaged in the sector and a mother who was wonderful, stay-at-home mom, but gave up her career. And I can remember having a conversation with my dad, again, who thought it was squirrely. And he said to me, Susannah, one of the things you've got to remember is no matter what you do with your life, if you decide to get married, have a husband, what have you, you also have to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. You've got to be able to make ends meet, because the husband that you might marry might get sick. He might lose his job. You might find yourself in a divorce. And what are you going to do about it? And so this was a couple of years after I recall him calling me squirrely, and it kind of hit me. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm 16 years old. What am I going to do? I better figure this out. And I didn't figure it all out, of course. I figured, okay, well, maybe I ought to study journalism. Maybe I wanted to be an international correspondent because I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to tell stories and do all this great stuff. And it was right around the time that Christiana Amanpour was sort of making her way up in CNN. But, I didn't have it all figured out then. But the one thing I did know at that time is I did not want to follow in the footsteps of my father in the energy industry. I wanted to get out of Alberta. But I also didn't want to fall in the footsteps of my mother, who gave it all up. And I think at various different points of time felt isolated. So there were 2 driving factors for me. 1, I didn't want to be in the energy sector, necessarily follow my father's footsteps. And then 2, I didn't want to find myself in a place where I was not free. I felt that I was too tied down to someone on the basis that I didn't have my own way of making my own money. And money wasn't so much the driver as it was a sense that I could be somewhat independent. So long story shorter, because it is a bit of a circuitous path to get to where I am today, I went down to the United States, had a scholarship. I studied journalism, realized that I still had more to learn. I ended up getting a graduate degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where I studied energy, environment, science, and technology. And this was in the mid-90s. And this was a point in time when Canada had signed the Kyoto Agreement. And the Kyoto Agreement was one of the first, not the first, but a pretty significant climate agreement between nations. And I remember studying that, and I remember studying the economics of natural resource development, the implications of environmental impacts. And during that period of time, also my graduate program, I went down to Santiago, Chile. And I worked for a company that was building the first combined cycle gas power plant to displace the coal-fired power plant that was burning a lot of power, creating all the power in the city of Santiago. But it was also creating a lot of smog, a lot of smoke. And of course, we know that coal is much more carbon intensive than natural gas. And so I became much more familiar, again, with energy, cleaner energy, meaning lower carbon emissions, lower NOx and SOx, particulates, things that cause asthma. And the important role of infrastructure, but also very importantly, the important conversation that needs to be had with communities as part of infrastructure development. Because one of my roles was also to go into the community to talk about that pipeline that was going to be bringing gas from Argentina across the Andes Mountains into Santiago to basically supply that power plant. And then I began to realize, oh my goodness, I'm actually really interested in this. I went all the way to Santiago, to Chile, Washington, D.C., only to find that I actually really do care about energy development, infrastructure development, but in particular where there is something better that comes with it. So having done that sabbatical away from graduate school, I graduated, and I hoped that I would go join the World Bank or the UN and develop energy in all these wonderful developing countries. But when I graduated, they weren't hiring, or they were not hiring me. And so I ended up at the time, late 90s, joining some technology companies that were doing a lot of business intelligence, data mining, and I became more involved in technology. But shortly after that, not shortly, but 5 years later, I found myself also in New York City, and 9/11 happened. And it was a period of time, too, that shook me because it made me realize, what am I doing here? Am I with people that I care about? Am I doing a job that I love? What is the purpose behind all this? And when you are that close to people who's lost their lives, kids whose parents are not coming home, you begin to really take stock of where you are. And it's unfortunate that sometimes you need these pivot moments to go, hold on, what am I doing? And so coming back after 9/11, I realized I'm not in a company that I feel purposeful in. It's not doing the things I believe in. I'm not in a relationship that's meaningful to me. It's time to go home. And so I actually ended up coming back to Calgary. I needed a job. Actually, let me say one more thing. I went down to Mexico for a couple of months. Then I went back to Calgary. And, I ended up putting my name in for a job at, which is now TransCanada Pipelines, TC Energy, just to help them with project development. Got a job, and about 7 years later, Shell hired me, and eventually I ended up in the role that I have today. So that's a bit of a longer story than you probably needed, but I think the important thing about all that is it's so important to me that the work that I do is meaningful. And it's not about generating all the money in the world, then, gets returned to the shareholder. That's a very important part of it. Like, we cannot make investments that don't make returns, because then we would not have those investments in the first place. And if the private sector doesn't make those investments, then it's on government to make those investments. But the way that government generates money is through the private sector in taxes, or through taxes on people. So there's a role here for the private sector, but the things that I do are really important to do where there's meaning beyond just generating profit for profit.
So what does your dad think? What did your dad think about you circling back after all of those journeys and education and traveling and coming back to a sector that he was involved in his whole life?
Yeah, it's a bit of a regret of mine, because my father passed away, shortly after I joined Shell. And Shell was where I really found that my career started to take off. And I can remember that one of the last Christmases that I went to go see him and my mother, it was wonderful. But it was about 2 days into the Christmas vacation where I got called back to a major crisis that Shell was managing. But I can remember my dad used to sit in the chair, and he was one of these people who had just smile. You could see the side of his lips curl up. And I can still remember the conversations that we would have. And I'd tell him of what I was doing. I could see the smile. The corners of his mouth go up. And I could see this pride. And my only regret, like I say, is that I really wish you were still around today, because there's so many more questions I would have, or how did you get through this thing? Or what did you think about that? And it's funny because my dad a bit had a reputation too of being a really tough negotiator, like really intimidating. And he did intimidate me for a very long period of time. But then when I got a little bit older and we could engage in conversations where we shared interests, the intimidation went away. It became a much more collaborative conversation. So, yeah, I think he was proud. And, I was certainly very happy to have someone I could talk to about various different energy issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, you carry yourself in such a way that as a female in, maybe previously a man's world. Now it's not. I'd say it's a lot more equal, but you are a very, very well-known, powerful person. So, and but you carry it with such grace. So it's amazing. And your leadership with Shell, unbelievable.
Thank you.
Your whole team, we know them. We've met quite a few of them, and they've participated in our youth camps, which you've directed to, and we think they've just been fantastic. What do you think?
Yes, I believe that the leadership is amazing. What have you found from you first starting with Shell, being a woman, being a female in a male dominated field? What did you feel when you first started, and are you seeing a paradigm shift in equality with more women getting into the field, whether it's on a technical Indigenous relations negotiation level?
Yeah.
What have you seen change? And do you think that because you're the leader that you are, that maybe you've driven a path for others to move forward and be accepted in that way?
Well, that could be a really long answer to that question, I think, because there's so many different elements to what is the impact of women in the workplace and in a company like Shell or in this sector, and what is the particular job that they're doing? Are they in management? Are they out in the field? And depending upon where you are in the sector and the organization that you're in, you'll be exposed to different things. And you'll have a different, equation of the number of men in the role versus women. And so, for example, if you're out at site on an asset or a refinery or even developing the LNG Canada project, you will find that there's many more men than women, just because there isn't as many women in the trades yet. And you're in remote communities. So typically that's been more men than women. That's beginning to change slowly. It's not quite yet there at all. But part of the reasons for that is because this remote work can sometimes be very difficult for moms or working mothers. And so there's some things that need to be adjusted there to see that balance change. But for those women that are working in some of these remote areas, it's pretty isolating still, I would imagine, unless you're able to bond with other women or there's that very comfortable place with men who become allies. In management, where I am, there's much more of an equal balance between men and women. It's not 50-50 yet. We're getting closer to that. We're probably around 30%, but still getting closer to that. But there's trade-offs too, and there's still, I think, cultural norms and expectations. And, I found for me as a working mother that I am trying to do it all. I'm trying to be a good mom still. I'm trying to be a very good employee. And so I'm still trying to do a lot of the household things. Granted, I'm a single parent, but I'm still trying to do it all. And men increasingly are trying to be great professionals, but also spend time at home. But we haven't completely shifted these norms. And so I think women are still picking up more of the household chores in addition to being at the workplace. And that just adds another layer. Now, again, that's shifting. And I think there's definitely more opportunity for men to do more things at home and much more accepted. But we're not yet there. So my own personal circumstances have been that I've been fortunate where I've come into companies in particular roles where, you know, the relationship to men hasn't held me back, or I haven't felt isolated or the only. And I've worked with a number of leaders and bosses who have been allies, meaning that they really want you to be successful. They acknowledge that you have other things going on in your world, and that's acceptable to them. You know, I work for Shell where when I have my kids, I want to be there as much as I can. And that's acceptable. If I need to work at home when they're there, that's acceptable. You know, if I need to travel, I need to travel. But there's a balance that I'm lucky to have that doesn't work, you know, for everybody, and it's not available to everybody. So again, I think it's shifting. I think it depends on the company. I think it depends on the role within the company. But I think the most important thing that we have to accept also from a societal perspective is that men and women can both be at home and at work and can share those responsibilities. And there isn't any stigma associated with that. And if we can get to that point, then it becomes much more easy to trade off these duties. And I think that we'll see even more equalization in organizations.
Yeah. I mean, we love how you have such a commitment to social equality, and it's amazing, and it really humanizes you as this person who's a figure who's running a large corporation. But I think, you know, as interesting as anything is, can you tell us why you've been so committed to, say, human trafficking and how you got involved and what you're doing about it, if you could let the audience know?
Yeah, thanks, Dean. And, you know, it's, for me, one of the things that I've always believed in is that you have to give back to communities and you need to participate in communities and associations. But what I was finding is I was saying yes to a lot of different things. And so I found myself really stretched, but not able to give as much as I'd like to give to each and everything that I've said I would do something for. And so it was about 4 years ago, I asked myself, if I'm going to spend time on one thing where I could have a bigger impact that's meaningful to me, but really important to the society and the place where I work, what would it be? And I realized that part of my work at LNG Canada, where I was dealing with a lot of Indigenous communities, where it was at the end of the Highway of Tears, you know, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report had come out. And I saw how important it was for Indigenous women and girls to have a place where they could actually step up. I began to say, well, I want to focus on how I can do that. And then it was just a circumstance that happened where I began to understand that, you know, from a friend, that disproportionately Indigenous women and girls are trafficked. And again, it was a correlation between the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. It was the conversation I was having with the community and other people who I trust. I said, okay, well, if there's a place where I want to spend time, this is where I want to spend time. And the friend that I was talking to is a country singer by the name of Paul Brandt. And he has a foundation he created called Not in My City. And Not in My City is all about human trafficking. And so we became friends. I began to get more familiar with his work. And then, you know, I was looking at all the various different organizations that are involved in human trafficking, but kind of like the energy transition, what I was seeing is that they're not as coordinated as they need to be to really accelerate the impact and change that we need. And so given the work that I have in the company, which is really looking at how do we change systems, you know, we can produce cleaner energy, but if customers aren't buying it, that doesn't work. Or if we're not distributing it because the infrastructure is not there. I began to ask the same questions about human trafficking.
Yeah.
You know, if we're raising awareness, that's great. But if the judicial system or the policing system isn't addressing it while we're raising awareness, then the crimes are still happening, but we're not actually prosecuting them. And we're not actually finding ways of actually shutting down the people that are causing these crimes and basically taking Indigenous women and girls without their willingness to do this sort of work, obviously. And I said, we have to start looking across the entire system. And so with this realization, I came back to British Columbia from a trip, and I remember going to a lunch, and I saw the Lieutenant Governor of BC there, Janet Austin, and I went straight up to her and I said, I need your help. We need to work on something here where we can start to build the network so we can look end to end on human trafficking and understand where the gaps are. We can raise awareness, but let's make sure that we're looking across the entire system. What's causing, you know, women and girls and others to get into this this to be trafficked? How do we stop that right at the beginning? But once they're trafficked, how do we pull them out? How do we recover? How do we make sure that they can come back into the world and society? What's the judicial system doing about it? How are they actually prosecuting the people who are actually the perpetrators of these crimes? And so that's where we created the BC Network for Human Trafficking, Anti-Human Trafficking. And that's really about stitching together all of the organizations, coordinating more effectively so that we can share information, so that we can learn about where the gaps are, and we can really have an incredible impact from the beginning of this so that Indigenous women and girls and others are not finding themselves recruited or groomed into this without their knowledge. And that's oftentimes what happens. And then we can pull them out, and then we can find that they can find a safe place where they can come back into society without, all of the impacts that having been trafficked can cause on someone. And that's what this is all about.
And I think, the educational component, we were invited to your networking event at Covenant House, and the amount that I learned in a couple hours, I really don't think I knew what the lowest level of human trafficking was. And it's happening right in front of your eyes, and it did as we grew up. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. What for our listeners that may not know, because when you think of human trafficking, you automatically think of a movie called Taken with Liam Neeson. Neeson. You automatically think about that. You're going, your daughter gets dropped off at an airport. She gets picked up. She gets hustled. There's professional networks that work with this. It's overseas. His daughter got taken twice for some reason. But regardless, that's how we think of human trafficking. And can you explain to our viewers and our listeners what the definition of human trafficking is and how we should be concerned? Because this is happening in Burnaby, in North Vancouver, in our backyards. It's our teenage daughters that are in their rooms on social media looking for love in all the wrong places and meeting up with people. I mean, this is dangerous.
Yeah, and so the piece of the trafficking that I'm really looking at, because you can be trafficked and you can be trafficked for work, but the piece that I'm really paying attention to is sex trafficking. And that is where individuals are taken without their will and they're trafficked for sex. And oftentimes it's because there's some hold over them by some individual who's trafficking them for money. And it's very difficult once you're in to get out. But it can happen to people who are having a relationship with an individual who's giving them a whole bunch of gifts, who then change that relationship into one, well, I will only give you this if you do that, or I have this information against you, or I will hurt someone that you care about unless you do this for me. So it becomes this relationship where the individual is held against their will, but is doing it because they're forced to. And so this is where sexual trafficking of individuals for sex is where I'm really spending my time on, against their will. Okay. And this is where we see the disproportionate impact on Indigenous women and girls. And my focus is on how do we prevent the grooming? Saying grooming can happen, and this is what's probably very surprising to people, where it happens in as you said, the backyard, in people's beautiful communities where an individual will have a relationship with someone whose full intention is to find a way to have information or some hold over them to then traffic them for sex. And that's what we've got to make people aware of. And that's what we have to make individuals aware of, is in relationship with someone where they're holding something against you, then using you and your body against your will for sex is not right. And when it's particularly with younger girls, it's absolutely not right. So that's the area that I'm really focused on. And working with the organizations, I have to say, that are experts in this field, coordinating the information between those who are raising awareness, going to schools. So Shell is supporting ending violence, as well as with the BC Lions, where it's basically ending violence in BC. They're going into schools with the BC Lions and promoting the idea of what is trafficking, so that you're aware this is what grooming looks like. You don't want to get involved in these sorts of things. At the same time, they're talking about bullying. So that's the area of focus that I'm really focused on. And it is just here. It's not in some foreign country. It's the fastest growing crime in Canada.
Wow.
That's and you have a daughter of your own.
Well, I was just thinking about that as I said that. And I could remember it was probably about 6 months ago. She was really on her phone, spending a lot of time on her phone, as kids do these days in social media. And then I found that she wanted to go for walks in the park. And I thought to myself, well, okay, but why are you going for a walk in the park? I became much more in tune, like, did somebody send you a message? Is somebody asking you to meet? Why are you doing these things?
Mm-hmm.
And So I became much more alert to my daughter. And then in particular, when you see changes in behavior, they become very despondent, very isolated. You have to ask the question, what's going on? And so these are some of the signals that you have to say. Someone is retreating. They're connected to a device. They're going off into locations and you don't know where. They're not themselves. And that was happening to my daughter, you know, and I'm like, whoa.
It's terrifying.
Whoa.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to share anything with you because part of it is that they feel ashamed or they're afraid. And thankfully, my daughter is not involved in trafficking. But seeing these things in my daughter and knowing that these are some of the signs, I was just, hang on a minute here. But that's how it starts.
Mm-hmm.
And next thing you know, people in your family, you know, might be in that situation. And it's where you have to really lean in and really understand what's going on.
No, I think it's really important to be in tune with that. And that's why marginalized communities that don't have a lot of focus on taking on where their youth are. Yeah. And it's interesting because we do kids camps, and thanks to Shell and your directive as well and your team, Shell has supported a third camp that's coming up for kids that are 11 to 18 years old, and that teaches social confidence, that teaches public speaking, team building, working within a group, what have you. But there are kids that don't know about this, a lot of the kids, so in our groups, the kids decide on businesses. And it's really interesting with Indigenous business, which is a reason why we created a TV show in the first place, is because Indigenous entrepreneurs, first and foremost, are looking for solutions to problems within their own community to elevate their own community, whether it's on a local, regional, national level. And a lot of these kids, and I would say probably about 50% of our communities with kids, are looking for an after-school program that can benefit them, where there's somewhere safe to go after school, where there are some eyes and ears on the youth, where they're able to not get parented, but they have a safe place to go. And I think that's a real need for communities, is to make sure that you know where your kids are after school, you know what they're doing after school, to provide them opportunities and after school programs for this, but particularly in Indigenous communities, which is why there's so many missing and murdered women and girls, is because we're not paying attention.
No. And there's so many reasons why that might be happening. You know, the parents may be working, or they may not have the opportunity to do that for one reason or another. So you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, the work that you are doing too really, truly has to be commended by going into these communities and the work of these entrepreneurial camps. I mean, it's outstanding. It's outstanding. And, you know, I'm really looking forward to see how each of these individuals continues in their life as a result of you being able to spend this time with them at this really important age, when we know that our kids, in particular teenagers, are beginning to say, what is my place in this world? And beginning to really have this kind of set of comparisons between the person next to them and them. Are they good enough? Are they good enough? Building confidence, giving them some of these basic skills. It couldn't happen at a more important time of development, and in communities that it's so exciting to see where they go next and how they prosper. So you guys deserve the medals for this work.
Oh gosh, it's our honor. And, you know, we learn so much as well. Every time we go to a different community, you learn about the community, but the kids and the time you spend with them, there really is nothing more fulfilling. You know, and you can see when you have like your staff come in and they volunteer their time, they're there for the weekend. And, you know, I think they don't really know what they're getting into until they start developing those relationships with the kids.
Yeah.
And I can just give our hats off. Big thumbs up to John. We had a really great time.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And,
well, they love it too. And they came back, and you can just tell they found something much more meaningful in that than they can have just in a regular job day to day. So thank you.
Yeah, no, and, you know, and I think we're finding more in a corporation like Shell, a few others as well. They're using this as corporate team building, right? And it's showing, because it does bring the humanity of your work to these communities.
Yeah,
it's great.
I think it really important about Shell as well, and personally for yourself, is about consultation, appropriate, authentic consultation. And I worked for the Squamish Nation for 13 years as their ECDEV officer. Alltech was one of our first clients, or our first partnerships, and Dean led the Indigenous Relations Department, Indigenous Advancement Department. And coming in, we didn't really know how it was very young. Wood fiber LNG was just a bare whisper that it was going to be going on. Impact benefit agreements with Fortis and BC Hydro, et cetera, and vetting companies that we were going to partner with core values that synergized with our core values. How is it that, and I know that when we spoke to Chastity Davis about reconciliation plans and why it's so important for companies to have that, and not just, and if you don't, you're a decade behind right now. But since you've started with Shell and working with Indigenous communities, because capital projects and projects go within communities all over Canada, what have you seen in the very beginning, and what do you see shifting now in respect of relations with Indigenous communities?
Yeah. Well, so when I came back to Canada, because I was overseas with Shell, I moved to British Columbia in 2013. And as you know, there weren't many treaties in BC, maybe one. And so therefore, a lot of the communities were not under treaty. And that shouldn't change how we approach Indigenous communities. But for me, it was more about, well, we need to make sure that we go out and we have conversations because, we don't know. Essentially, we have to assume rights and title. We don't have a treaty to turn to and say, okay, this is how this should be expressed. But it was something about really understanding that we had to do this in partnership. And I say that because I found that having been in British Columbia and working directly with communities that weren't under treaty, to some extent, I felt that in other places in the country that were under treaty, some of these things were taken for granted. You didn't have to build these relationships. You didn't have to go through the same degree of development and questions and consultation. And I found that was a bit of a mistake. And I think we see that as a mistake. And so what I've seen, even since the time I came to BC in 2013, is, land acknowledgements as a symbol and as something to recognize the land on which you operate, you work, you live, you play, was something we did in BC all the time. When I went back to Alberta in the 2013, 2014, it was rare. And so that has shifted now where we begin to see that reconciliation is becoming much more real, not just to people who are going out to communities, but to business leaders too. And I firmly believe that Indigenous relations is not for the Indigenous relations advisor or manager. It's for all of us. From the top of the house to the person in the field to the Indigenous relations advisor who will have different insights, but we all are responsible. And that I think is changing too. I think the other thing that with experience is happening is that because there's been so much mistrust, Indigenous communities, for good reason, with corporations, the corporations have been afraid to engage. And therefore, there's this chasm between, okay, it's comfortable, it's not comfortable, but how do we start the conversation? We don't trust you, we don't trust you. And so you kind of got to go, okay, wait a minute. The past is the past. Let's come together today and agree how we work together to move things forward. We can't say the past didn't happen because it did, and we need to basically reconcile for that. But what we have today in front of us is a relationship that we're going to build, and we're going to build this relationship on trust, and trust takes time. And if we can do that, and I use an expression, I didn't coin it, but transparency is the currency of trust, we begin to find over time, even when there's disagreements, if you're sharing information early and they're making sure that this is a relationship you want to preserve, then you find that even with disagreements, you still have that foundation of trust in which you can disagree, but you can still move forward. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that I think what I'm seeing is that increasingly this chasm or this feeling of how do we engage is overcome, and relationships are being developed upon which we can now build opportunities and joint opportunities between corporations, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous corporations. I mean, we're beginning to see more and more of that too. So that's really encouraging, and even frankly more to come in this country, which I think is precedent setting and also probably something globally we would look to as well. Of how do we rebuild relationships with Indigenous communities that are meaningful, purposeful, and go beyond the impact benefit agreement. That really involve the community in such a way that they have, my friend Crystal Smith would say, a share and a say. And that's pretty powerful too.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, we have to what really did set this trend is not having treaty in BC. BC communities and First Nations and land title. It really did in our career for the past 25 years. We've seen it actually spread east, right?
Absolutely.
Which has been interesting, and we're doing work out east in the energy sector, and they can. I think everyone in there would acknowledge that we are 10, 15 years ahead of where we were. And, and when we started, I'd say all of us together and working with the communities and, creating, inclusion, which wasn't a word when we started, right? It wasn't in an RFP,
No.
right? It was just, are you doing the right thing or not? And, there's some companies that got it. Alltech was one of them. Robin Lucas, a mentor of ours, there wasn't any inclusion weighted in the RFP, but when we met each other and I was working with Right to Play and working with communities and doing some other things, he just said, well, it's just the right thing to do. Right. And because of that, it's really put them, we believe, as, ahead of their competition, but more importantly, ahead of the curve in Canada for.
And all of the positive benefits that go with that, which is communities are prospering, in such a way, which is, yes, they're taking some revenues and incomes, but their people are finding work, they're growing in their careers. And I think it's very, very exciting.
I agree. And I know that Shell has many different initiatives. And when we talk about profit with purpose, all of us in organizations, even as large as Shell or even the small micro businesses, we have to make a profit. We know we're impacting, whether it's the environment or the traditional territories or what have you. But what are some of the initiatives that Shell does support? I know that we've talked about human trafficking and bringing awareness to that. That's really big. Of course, entrepreneurs, because procurement is so huge. If you're listening and you're in industry, or if you're an entrepreneur, you all know what that procurement means, and that is really utilizing sources and resources within community first and foremost, before you outsource to other opportunities. And I've worked for the Squamish Nation. I have also worked for Alltech with Dean and their Indigenous Advancement Department, and procurement was so important to us, but also acknowledging that being from a nation, you have to set yourself up for success. It's very easy to stand and stomp your feet and say, we're not getting any work and no one's utilizing our services. So with Squamish, when we were getting overlooked for so many different opportunities, it's because we didn't provide that information. We created a directory. We updated our directory on a regular basis. So it didn't just involve employment and training, because we're very rich resourced here in the Lower Mainland with opportunities. So if you want to work, you're working. If you don't or can't work, you're not. And so employment and training not necessarily is for this area one of the biggest needs, but you can also, as an industry leader, provide opportunities to nations for corporate gifting, for artists, for big installations, any kind of artwork, educational programs like Shell helps with the Bears Lair, even being on a national TV show, so that you can really promote opportunity and support entrepreneurs. So what are some of the initiatives?
Well, so certainly Inspire is one of those that we've supported over the years, for many years, actually. We also are doing some work with Livewire, and we do some of the things at the Banff Centre that also help Indigenous communities or individuals actually grow careers and capacity and skills. But beyond that, too, with each of our projects, or even what we call assets, Scotford Upgrader and Refinery north of Edmonton, they would be looking at any projects they would do, contracting procurement with communities, with Indigenous companies. That's another element that when we look at who we're contracting with, is this Indigenous company? Do they employ Indigenous people? What is the local content of that? The Indigenous content. So those are some big ticket contracts too. I think the last time I looked, the LNG Canada project has close to $4 billion to Indigenous and local community contracts. $4 billion. And significantly, those are nation-owned businesses. That the revenues are going straight back to the nation. It's pretty amazing. So contracting with Indigenous communities is another really key part of that. And then, certainly gifting is important too. And we're sharing that within the community. In fact, we have but we have several art installations in Calgary as well as in Sarnia. If you go to Sarnia, where we have a refinery too, you can look at one of the tanks. It's a wonderful piece of art from a local Indigenous painter. And so we are finding wherever we can to find opportunities to actually basically procure and contract with Indigenous artists and also companies that can provide work for our projects and other things. I would say, though, that there's still much more to do, and I think part of that is growing the capacity between ourselves and the Indigenous companies and individuals to understand the work that we can do together. And it's also saying, well, this is where it's worked really well, and sharing the best practice across the company. This is another area where I say, well, I see this as pockets of excellence, but I see this over here is not really doing enough. So how do we share so that we can actually begin to reward where things are going really well and actually say, okay, well, this is what we can do better over here, and start to lift the boats together so we can actually increase, increase the playing field, increase the benchmark for what good looks like. And then at the same time, grow capacity in the communities and within the company of understanding what it'll take or who we should contract with.
That's an excellent answer. I know that that I was on a panel for the Forward Summit that was in Calgary, and we talked about authentic consultation. We talked about restrictions in budget.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of companies out there that are restricted in budgets, and it's declining budgets on how to get involved for initiatives. So they're really limited in what to pick and choose to support. And what I love about Shell is that and other companies like Capital Power, for example, where you don't have to have money or budgets to be able to participate in the elevation and relationship building with community. You can volunteer.
Yeah.
There's lots of different opportunities where you could, for example, with the kids camps. I know one of your a couple of your employees of Shell's employees, John and Daniel and Vanessa, lovely humans, came and volunteered for a kids camp. With the Squamish Nation, for example, we've had. I always say when you have events, even if you're supporting fundraisers for communities, you can be the first one to show up.
Yeah.
To ask if the community needs any help with setting things up, and also the last one to leave, to ask if you can need help cleaning up.
Yeah.
And those kind of relationships, when I worked at Squamish, speak volumes. They're still incredibly good friends and colleagues today that I would vouch for whatever company that they work for would want to participate with that. And that's relationship building that's subtle. Asking if you can help deliver hampers for the elders at Christmas time, anything like that. So I would put it out to all industry and challenge to really get your Indigenous Relations Department, if you have one. If you don't, you should, on how you can get a board or you can get some volunteers together where you can really make a difference, because Shell has that.
We do, and definitely, and actually we're on a platform too where you can actually use your hours and actually have those. So Benevity is where we actually find that we can use our volunteer hours and basically get compensation towards charities as a result of that. So that's really good. But what you're describing, though, is something that I think is a basic question about humanity, not just corporations and communities. It really has to do with the fact that if somebody's struggling or somebody needs help, we shouldn't say, well, that's not my job. We should say, well, let me see how I can help. And let me see that the differences between us shouldn't hold us back from helping each other deal with challenges in front of us. And I can remember I go to the Coastal Church in Vancouver, and I can remember the pastor was talking about the fact that, they needed some people when you go to church and they help you find your seat or they hand out your pamphlet. And he said, we're short of people because people think that's not their job, but it's everybody's job, actually. You don't have to think it's somebody else's. You could do that too. If there's a gap, fill it. If somebody needs a lift, give them a lift. That's a basic humanity question. I think that we get so isolated in our own little worlds that we forget everybody else around us has their own little worlds, but our common element is we're just basic people trying to get through the day. Even though we may be in different walks of life, we look different, we dress different, we talk different, we're human beings. And we forget that, I think. And that, I think, is where it comes down to respecting that first, and then everything else goes away.
Yeah. Well, this is why you're such an incredible person and leader, is just the passion you have for that and the emotion. It's
we build up walls to
Mm-hmm.
differentiate ourselves from each other or to isolate ourselves. And I work really hard, and I'm definitely really imperfect at it, of trying not to do that, trying to recognize that we're all here to help each other. And it gets really hard when you have to work in a world where you've got to be driven, you've got to do these various different things. But I'm trying to create space that we might have shared goals that are in a corporate setting that drive towards a particular outcome for the organization, but we also are human beings in this organization. Okay. And let's respect each other. Let's care for each other. Let's hold each other's hands. Let's not look at our hierarchy and say that I'm better than you. We're all in this together, kind of, at the end of the day.
And it all leads to something that's going to benefit all of us. In my case, showing up early and leaving late led to me getting married.
Yeah, well, I was gonna go there too. This whole relationship.
It's true.
It's amazing, though.
It's true. And I'm always showing up late and having to rush out somewhere else. And so we've got a yin to the yang. And I love that. And it's interesting what you're talking about, because there's, when I, again, was at the Ford Summit, which was really great. I'll put in a plug for that. Great organization. And
Good to hear.
Yeah, great conference that we went to. But one of the panelists said something that, the most popular radio station is not WIFM. What's in it for me?
Oh, love it.
Because really, we were talking about consultation, and when people approach us to do business, what's in it for me? I'm only approaching you because I need something.
Yeah.
I'm only approaching you because I want something, and I'm only following up because I want something. And if you can keep that relationship build going with people where it's consistent communication on a regular basis, because you really care about what's going on with the community, not because you have to make your deliverables, or not because you need to keep up with what your commitments are, and the cream really does rise to the top. And you are such a phenomenal person, and you are right at the very top.
Can I just say, you're a phenomenal individuals and couple too. I mean, if we want to see what a relationship looks like, I just look to the two of you. You guys are so amazing together.
Well, I love you, Susannah Pierce.
I love you too.
And if people want to find out more about human trafficking, if you want to support this great initiative, I know that YVR has a great initiative where I believe
YVR picked up Not in My City, and so now when you go there, you can see, in the bathrooms who to call essentially, or get more information. And I'll say this for Shell. I mean, at our 1,400, retail stations, or where you fill up your car with gas or charge with EV now, you'll also see that as of July 1st, we're going to be putting the 1-800 numbers for the Center for Human Trafficking in all of our stations as well. So that's raising awareness. That's that piece.
It's so important.
Yeah, it really is.
It is raising awareness, and especially in transportation spots, like filling up for gas at the airport. I know that it was so profound. I believe at that point, and that was a couple of months ago, we went to the event to bring awareness to this, that 58% of the employees, everywhere from the baggage handlers to the ticket handlers to security to what have you, have been shown signs and how to approach people and how to save people. And it would be
trained.
Really,
it's outstanding. And, TransLink was also part of, the network launch. And it's outstanding too, because they're going to be doing things. And Kevin Quinn, who came from Maryland, also has experience here. So, this is where you begin to see, and I love the expression about ripples. I used to believe that you have to make a big tidal wave to have an impact, but actually what we have to do is just create these ripples. And these ripples will then have these more ripples. And that's what excites me, because this is a very good example of ripples. We're beginning to have ripples in this area. And as I said, it's about connecting across the human trafficking ecosystem. But these ripples are having an impact, and that fills me with a lot of hope.
Amazing. So how can people find out more about this and how they can support this initiative?
So they can certainly contact me on LinkedIn. They can also go to the website, which is the BC Network for Anti-Human Trafficking, which is currently housed by the Lieutenant Governor's office. That will be transitioning in time, but you can go to either one of those places, and we can get you all linked in.
Amazing. So, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Dean. It's awesome to be with both of you.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Lair. Please follow us, download this episode, and follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok.